The Chicago winter was relentless. Snow whipped through the valleys between buildings, and the cold wind from Lake Michigan froze the city. On such a chilly evening, Diane Brown had just finished her last meeting on the upper floor of a high-rise office building towering over Chicago's downtown area known as the Loop. "That was a wonderful presentation, Diane." "The client is thrilled," said Carol, the marketing director, patting Diane's shoulder lightly. Diane smiled in thanks and gazed out the large conference room window. The lights of Chicago sparkled in the snowy landscape. As vice president of the advertising agency New Horizons, she had earned the right to enjoy this view. Diane's talent was well known throughout the company, particularly her creative strategy planning and cool-headed negotiation skills. 15 years since diving into this industry after college graduation, she had steadily built her career and now managed more than 20 employees. Back in her office, her smartphone vibrated on her desk. It was a message from her husband, Mark. "Working late again. Get dinner on your own." Diane sighed softly. Again? She checked her calendar and stared at the date marked there. Next month would be their 10th wedding anniversary. 15 years since they met on campus, and nearly 10 years since they married. Mark worked as a real estate agent in the Chicago suburbs. Tall with boyish good looks, he had majored in economics in college. Immediately after graduation, he entered the real estate industry with ambitions to own my own company someday, but that dream hadn't yet materialized. Diane had noticed something strange about Mark's behavior over the past few months. He was coming home late more often, leaving the room to take phone calls, and had started password protecting his computer. Most significantly, the sparkle in his eyes when he looked at her was gone. After tidying her office, Diane put on her coat and headed home. Her boots left small footprints in the accumulating snow. They hadn't had children. During their first few years together, both had focused on establishing their careers. They had discussed children later, but somehow it kept getting postponed, and now the topic rarely came up. Still, Diane had believed she was satisfied with her career and marriage. At least until recently. When she arrived at their condominium, the lights were still off, as expected. She took her keys from her bag and opened the door. "I'm home," she called out. No answer, of course. Diane took off her coat and headed to the kitchen. She took a wine bottle from the refrigerator and poured a glass. The deep color of the red wine shimmered beautifully in the kitchen's ambient lighting. Sitting down in the living room, she opened her laptop. Checking the history of their joint bank account had become a habit for her lately. Since getting married, they had always been open about finances. Diane's income was stable and more than triple Mark's. She deposited most of it into their joint account, with the implicit understanding that Mark would manage household expenses from that account. Looking at recent transactions, she noticed several suspicious withdrawals again. A transfer of $5,000 labeled only as a consulting fee. There had been a similar withdrawal last week. Diane recorded the details in her notebook and took a sip of wine. Just then, Mark's computer in the study made a faint notification sound. He must have forgotten to log out. Diane hesitated. Should she respect his privacy? But wasn't this their shared home? And those strange withdrawals were coming from her own earnings. She quietly stood up and walked to the study. The computer screen displayed a real estate listing for a mansion in the upscale Gold Coast neighborhood. The selling price was $1.2 million. Diane frowned. They had no plans to buy such a house, at least, she hadn't heard about it. What concerned her even more was another open tab. Email. Though she knew she shouldn't look, the sender's name froze her in place, Christy Morgan. Part of the content was visible. Mark, last night was wonderful. I can't wait for the new house you promised. Diane gasped. Her head spun, and for a moment she almost collapsed, but the cool composure she had developed through years of business negotiations steadied her. She took a deep breath, took a screenshot as evidence, and quietly returned to the living room. Mark came home after 11 o'clock. He smelled of cleanliness after a shower, but underneath lingered the faint scent of a woman's perfume. "How was your day?" Diane asked calmly. Her voice betrayed nothing. Same as usual. Showed a client around a big property, Mark said, taking a beer from the refrigerator and sitting on the sofa. How about yours? The presentation for the new campaign went well. The client seemed satisfied. Oh, that's good. Mark's response was perfunctory, his lack of interest obvious. His eyes were glued to his smartphone screen. Diane raised her glass and coolly observed him. She remembered the day 15 years ago when he first approached her under the trees on campus. Where had that passionate gaze gone, that smile that appeared whenever he looked at her? And when had her income become funding for his affair? Mark, next month is our wedding anniversary, she said quietly. He glanced up briefly. Oh, right. Do you want to do something special? Well, it's a special day. Maybe a nice dinner would be good. Sounds good. Could you make a reservation? I've been busy with work lately. Diane nodded. He still hadn't noticed. He didn't know that she had already contacted a lawyer and begun gathering evidence. That she was devising a plan to let his betrayal be his own undoing. That night, after Mark went to bed first, Diane remained in the living room and checked the bank records once more. She discovered that suspicious withdrawals and transfers from their joint account had begun at least 6 months ago. The total amounted to nearly $500,000, most of her savings. Diane closed her laptop and sat alone in the dark living room, contemplating her next steps. She tilted her wine glass and drained the last drop. Seated at the central table of Chicago's most renowned restaurant, La Lumiere, Diane gazed at the beautiful sunset through the window. When making the reservation for their 10th anniversary dinner, she had specifically requested this window-side table. She took a sip from her champagne flute and glanced at her watch. Mark was 15 minutes late. Not surprising. Over the past few weeks, she had continued collecting evidence while maintaining a calm facade. Bank records, photos of Mark's emails, credit card statements, all showing his relationship with a woman named Christy and his misuse of funds. Sorry to keep you waiting, Diane. Turning around, she saw Mark approaching with flair. His hair was more meticulously styled than usual, he wore a new tie, and his expression was visibly elated. He gave his wife a light kiss and took his seat. You chose a lovely restaurant, Mark looked around. These past 10 years with you have been wonderful. For me too, Mark, Diane smiled. A waiter brought menus. Mark ordered champagne and repeatedly checked his smartphone. Watching him, Diane didn't bother asking who he was expecting messages from and silently chose her appetizer. 10 years. Hard to believe, Mark said. Do you remember when we first met on campus? Yes, after that economics lecture. You bought me coffee. You already had your future plans firmly in place back then, Mark laughed. And now you're a vice president. The conversation drifted to memories of the past, their first date, the proposal scene, honeymooning in Paris. On the surface, they looked like a happy couple celebrating their wedding anniversary. But Diane could clearly see Mark's restlessness and that he was hiding something. As the main course ended and dessert arrived, Mark suddenly pulled out a large envelope he had placed beside him. Diane, I have a surprise for you since tonight is special. Diane prepared herself. She had been perfectly playing ignorant for weeks in anticipation of this moment. Mark took several glossy photos from the envelope and arranged them on the table. They were photos of a luxurious mansion, marble staircase, spacious living room, backyard with a pool. Look, I finally bought our dream home. Prime location in Gold Coast. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, with a private wine cellar, Mark explained excitedly. We get the keys next week. Diane examined each photo carefully. She already knew about this house, the listing she'd seen on Mark's computer and the purchase records she'd investigated through her lawyer. It's beautiful, but how? She asked quietly. At that moment, Mark's face changed. His superficial smile transformed into something more fundamental, more sinister. I finally bought my dream home. For me and my lover. With your money, of course. The words flowed from his mouth like poison. He leaned back deeply in his chair, watching her reaction with enjoyment. Christy and I will start a new life in this house. Instead of you, Mark continued. Your savings have finally come in handy. Diane picked up her wine glass and slowly swirled it. Watching the red wine create a vortex, she smiled. Mark showed a moment of confusion. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Congratulations, Mark. It really is a lovely house, Diane said quietly. I hope you'll be happy there with your mistress. Mark frowned. So, you're not angry? You're not going to scream and cry? Why should I? Diane shrugged. I've known all along about your affair with Christy, about you buying a house with my savings. The blood drained from Mark's face. What, since when? Long enough, Diane took a sip of wine. I have evidence of everything you've been doing behind my back. Humph, so what? Mark regained his composure and snorted. It's over now. You'll have to leave tomorrow. I've already contacted a divorce lawyer. I see, all right, Diane responded calmly, quietly taking out her smartphone. After a few taps, she stood up. I'll stay at a hotel tonight. Have a nice evening, Mark. Before leaving the restaurant, she leaned close to him and whispered, but remember. You no longer have a home to return to. Mark tried to understand her words but soon shrugged them off. He felt slightly uneasy at Diane's unusual calmness but began sending a message to Christy, everything's going according to plan. She's leaving tomorrow. As Diane left the restaurant, she looked up at the night sky. The stars shone coldly. Her smartphone vibrated. A message from her lawyer, as planned, the foreclosure team will arrive at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Diane smiled. In the car on the way back from the restaurant, Mark was excited. He read Christy's reply messages over and over, occasionally breaking into a satisfied smile. Diane's unusual calmness left a corner of anxiety in his mind, but it was quickly washed away by his anticipation for his new life. When we get home, you should just take what you need and go to a hotel, Mark told Diane. You'll hear from my lawyer tomorrow. Diane nodded faintly as she gazed at the night view outside the window. I understand. But I'll contact my own lawyer. Back at the condominium, Diane said, I need to prepare for tomorrow, and headed straight to the bedroom. Mark remained in the living room, turned on the television, and opened a beer. The luxury of a victor. He was about to leap toward his ideal future, using his 10-year marriage and Diane's savings as a stepping stone. In the bedroom, Diane was packing only the essentials in her suitcase. But in reality, she was sending her final emails, confirming tomorrow's schedule, giving final instructions to her lawyer, and verifying details with the bank. She had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The next morning, Mark awoke to sunlight. The opposite side of the bed was empty, Diane was gone. He stretched with satisfaction and picked up his smartphone to call Christy. Good morning, beautiful, Mark said in a sweet voice. Today marks the beginning of our new life. Let's go to our new home around noon. I've already received the keys. Christy's excited voice leaked from the speaker. I can't wait. How did Diane take it? As expected, she quietly left, Mark lied. In fact, he didn't know when Diane had gone. Now it's just the two of us. Barely finishing breakfast, Mark hurriedly got ready. He planned to pick up Christy and head to their new home together. Christy had been Mark's client. He had promised her he was about to get divorced and had been secretly involved with her for the past 6 months. At 11 a.m., Mark's car entered the beautiful tree-lined avenue in the Gold Coast district. Christy was in the passenger seat, her eyes shining as she admired the surrounding mansions. I can't believe we'll be living here, she said excitedly. How did you find this house? Inside information from the real estate industry, Mark answered proudly. I got it before it even hit the market. When they parked in front of the new house, Mark frowned momentarily. Several unfamiliar cars were parked at the gate, and a few men were standing in front of the house talking. One wore a suit, the others were in work clothes. I wonder what's going on, Christy asked anxiously. Probably some final inspection, Mark answered uncertainly. Wait here. He got out of the car and headed toward the gate. At that moment, another car arrived, and Diane stepped out with a middle-aged man. Mark stopped in his tracks. Diane? What are you doing here? Diane approached him with a calm expression. Good morning, Mark. Is Christy with you? Perfect timing. What's going on here? Mark displayed his anger. This is my house. No, it isn't. The man standing next to Diane stepped forward. I'm George Hamilton, representing Diane Brown. This property is currently under legal seizure. The blood drained from Mark's face. What? Christy also got out of the car and approached with a confused expression. What's happening, Mark? This man has committed fraud, Hamilton the lawyer explained calmly. He withdrew funds from a joint account without his wife's consent and purchased this property. His actions constitute clear financial fraud, and the police are now investigating. Mark's face turned pale. This is ridiculous. Diane, what's going on? You said it yourself, Mark, Diane answered quietly. I bought a home for myself and my mistress, with your money. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. Diane took out her smartphone and scrolled through the screen. I collected all the evidence, your messages with a Christy, hotel receipts, records of fraudulent withdrawals from our joint account. Christy, did you know? Diane turned to her. That he was married and trying to buy a house for you both with my savings? Christy's face went pale. She stared at Mark and shook her head tearfully. He said he had just gotten divorced. That he had separated amicably from his ex-wife. You're a victim of fraud too, Diane said with sympathy. He was lying to you as well. No, Chris. Mark tried desperately to explain. This is just a temporary issue. It will be resolved quickly. It will not be resolved, Hamilton the lawyer said sternly. The court has already issued a foreclosure order. This house will be auctioned, and the misappropriated funds will be returned. Seeing the foreclosure notice, posted on the front of the house, Mark began to understand the reality. His face twisted with anger and fear. This is nonsense. We're married. The joint account belongs to both of us. While it is indeed a joint account, Hamilton explained calmly, it's illegal to use your spouse's assets for fraudulent purposes. In particular, you gave false explanations to your wife and moved large sums of money without her knowledge. Christy tearfully backed away from Mark. You deceived me. You're the worst. Chris, wait. Mark tried to chase after her, but she jumped into her car and sped away. Left behind, Mark leaned against the gatepost as if collapsing. His dream of a new life was shattering before his eyes. I'll give you until tomorrow to pack up your remaining belongings, Diane said calmly. After that, you won't be allowed in the condominium either. And of course, not in this house starting today. Mark, overwhelmed by helplessness, remained silent. The fragility of his plan and his own foolishness now struck him acutely. As Diane returned to her car with Hamilton, she glanced back at Mark one last time. Her eyes reflected both the glimmer of victory and a quiet sadness for the end of their 10-year marriage. Goodbye, Mark, her voice faded into the wind. You no longer have a place to return to. The Chicago District Court was wrapped in solemn silence. Only the judge's voice echoed against the thick wooden walls. Mark sat at the defendant's table, unable to raise his face, looking down. His once confident expression was now covered with exhaustion and despair. 3 months had passed since the foreclosure. Locked out of the condominium and rejected by Christy, Mark had been sleeping on a college friend's sofa. The defendant, Mark Brown, is found guilty of financial fraud and breach of trust against his spouse, Diane Brown. The judge's words were unforgiving. The defendant is ordered to return the full amount of $573,000 wrongfully withdrawn from the joint account to the plaintiff. Additionally, I order payment of $250,000 in emotional damages to the plaintiff. On the opposite side of the courtroom, Diane sat quietly with her lawyer. Her expression showed neither triumph nor sadness, only quiet determination. Furthermore, I order payment of $150,000 in damages for fraudulent actions and emotional distress toward the additional plaintiff, Christy Morgan. Mark covered his face, his shoulders trembling. Christy was also sitting at the back of the courtroom. She too had sued Mark. Angered by his double betrayal, she had decided to take her own legal action on Diane's advice. Considering the defendant's current financial situation, I order that 30% of all his income for the next 10 years be automatically garnished to compensate the plaintiffs. The judge removed his glasses and stared directly at Mark. You deceived and financially and emotionally exploited two women. You must pay the price. When the trial ended and they stepped into the hallway, Mark tried to approach Diane. Diane, please, let's talk, his voice trembled pleadingly. I never thought it would come to this. Won't you give me another chance? Diane turned and calmly looked at her former husband. You made your choice, Mark. Accept all the consequences. As she was about to leave, Mark grabbed her arm. At least let me get my belongings, my personal things. The building manager will be there tomorrow morning. You can come then, but only for what you absolutely need. Diane shook off his hand and walked away. The next day, when Mark visited the condominium, his belongings were already packed in cardboard boxes, stacked at the entrance. 10 years of his life fit into just a few boxes. Expensive suits, watches, golf clubs. What had once been his status symbols were now mere baggage. A few weeks later, Mark received a call from his boss at the real estate agency. I'm sorry, but we have to let you go. The news of the trial has damaged the company's image. We cannot tolerate fraudulent behavior that questions your credibility as a real estate agent. After hanging up, Mark just sat dazed in his apartment room. A small room borrowed through a friend's kindness. Unemployed, with 30% of his future income garnished, plus enormous compensation payments. Dark clouds loomed over his future. Meanwhile, Diane had purchased a new apartment and moved in. The condominium was sold, and that money became the foundation for her new life. Her talent was recognized at the advertising agency, and talks of a promotion to president had begun. One day, an email arrived at her office. It was from Christy. Can we meet? I'd like to talk. Meeting at a cafe, the two started with an awkward silence. But as victims of the same man's deception, they gradually began to open their hearts. I just wanted to apologize to you, Christy said, lowering her eyes. With your husband and... I thought he was single. You don't need to apologize, Diane said kindly. We were both deceived by him. But if you hadn't helped me, I would have been his next victim, Christy expressed her gratitude. From that day on, the two began to keep in regular contact. Diane sent Christy advice on how to judge men and manage finances, while Christy offered Diane fashion tips and hints for new encounters. A strange friendship blossomed. Meanwhile, Mark's downfall continued. Unable to find real estate work in Chicago again, he eventually had no choice but to return to his parents' small town in Ohio. Living in a detached part of his parents' house, he started a part-time job at a local convenience store. Most of his monthly salary was deducted as compensation for Christy and Diane. How did it come to this? Mark often thought, staring at the ceiling at night. I knew something was off about Diane's reaction then, why didn't I realize it? In his mind, Diane's calm smile at the restaurant repeatedly resurfaced. The true meaning of her words, you no longer have a home to return to, he now understood. One day, as winter passed and spring began to color Chicago, Diane was working at a coffee shop on the shores of Lake Michigan. At the company, the campaign she had led was a great success, and her promotion seemed certain. Is this table taken? Looking up at the gentle male voice, an attractive man in a suit stood there. He had kind eyes. Please, Diane smiled. I'm James Harrison. I work at a law firm nearby, he introduced himself. I'm Diane Carter, she used her maiden name. I'm the vice president of an advertising agency. From that day, they regularly met at that cafe. Starting with work talk, they gradually moved to more personal topics. Diane was cautious. Past betrayal had given her wariness. However, James's sincerity and thoughtfulness gradually melted the walls around her heart. At the same time, Diane had started a new project, establishing a non-profit organization to support women's rights and victims of financial fraud. From her own experience, she strongly wanted to help women in similar situations. On local television news, the NPO's activities were featured. "We teach women how to become financially independent and protect themselves from fraud," Diane said in an interview. In a small apartment in Ohio, Mark was watching that news. Diane's image on the screen was confident and shining more beautifully than before. He dropped the remote in a daze. What have I lost? In the end, it was he himself who had lost the home he should return to. Thank you all for gathering here today. Diane Carter surveyed the packed venue from the podium. Dressed in an elegant evening gown, she captivated the audience with her confident smile. 2 years had passed. The Grand Hotel's ballroom in Chicago was hosting the Second Chance Foundation's second anniversary gala. This NPO, established by Diane, supported women who had been victims of financial fraud and provided programs to promote economic independence. In 2 years, more than 100 women had received support, and many had begun walking new paths in life. This foundation was born from my own experience, Diane spoke softly. What seemed lost turned out to be a new beginning. In the front row, James Harrison watched her with a warm gaze. They had gotten engaged a year ago and were preparing for a small wedding ceremony. James had accepted Diane's past and fully supported her activities. His law firm handled the foundation's free legal consultations. Christy Morgan was also in the audience. She was now Diane's close friend and an active volunteer for the foundation. Having recovered from Mark's betrayal, she had started her own interior design company and was enjoying success. What we've learned here is the importance of not being bound by the past, Diane continued. And that even harsh experiences can be transformed into power to help others. Appointed as president of New Horizons advertising agency, Diane was leading a fulfilling life, balancing work and NPO activities. Her reputation had spread beyond the industry, and she had been nominated for Businesswoman of the Year. The gala had attracted much media coverage, with local news programs broadcasting her speech live. Parts of it were scheduled to air on national networks. To women in difficult situations, you are not alone. A new path will surely open for you. Her words were also heard in a small apartment in Ohio. Mark Brown sat in front of the television, watching his former wife. He still worked at the local convenience store, with most of his salary going to compensation payments. Regret lingered in his eyes, but it was now irretrievable. Mark was acutely aware of the consequences of his own choices every day. Seeing Diane smiling and holding hands with her fiancé on television, he silently changed the channel. After the gala, Diane and James were walking along the shores of Lake Michigan. The full moon's light reflected on the lake, creating a beautiful water path. Today was wonderful, Diane nestled against his arm. I'm happy thinking we can help even more women from now on. You're amazing, James kissed her cheek. To transform past pain into something so beautiful. Diane suddenly stopped and gazed at the lake under the moonlight. At that time, I thought the world had ended. But now I understand, she smiled quietly. It wasn't the end, but the true beginning. She held her engagement ring up to the moonlight. A symbol of a new promise, a new future. The home she thought she had lost was actually within her all along. And with her own choices, she had built a new home.